The woman carrying my husband's child struck me across the face in a courtroom. I was 34 weeks pregnant. Her ring caught the corner of my mouth, splitting the skin, and the crack of her palm echoed through the oak-paneled room. I tasted blood before I felt pain. My first instinct was not to touch my cheek. Both hands went to my stomach. My son kicked once beneath my ribs. Across the aisle, my husband, Adrian Cole, looked at Vanessa Reed's raised hand and smiled. It was not shock. It was the small, private smile of two people who believed they had already won. I had seen that smile before, over dinners, in hospital corridors, and once during my father's memorial service, when Adrian thought I was too numb to notice. But that morning, in front of a bailiff, a court reporter, 3 attorneys, and Judge Mercer, it was finally aimed directly at me. Something inside me became quiet. My lawyer's chair beside me was empty. Daniel Cross had texted that another hearing had run late and that he would arrive within minutes. Adrian had come with an entire legal team. Vanessa stood behind him in a cream suit, still breathing hard, as though she might strike me again. The bailiff stepped forward. Judge Mercer rose slightly from the bench. Then she spoke 2 words that erased the color from Adrian's face. "Lock it." The courtroom doors closed with a heavy click. That was the moment my marriage truly ended. But to understand why the judge sealed the room and why Adrian suddenly looked terrified, I need to go back 7 years, to a summer evening in Savannah, Georgia, when I was 26 and still believed intelligence could protect a person from being deceived. My name is Clara Bennett. I grew up around Bennett & Rowe Properties, the investment company my grandfather founded in 1984 with 1 renovated warehouse and a loan nobody expected him to repay. By the time I finished college, it owned office buildings, retail centers, and apartment complexes across 2 states. My father, Thomas Bennett, became CEO when I was 18. He was disciplined, cautious, and almost impossible to impress. He taught me that inherited wealth was not an achievement. Stewardship was. I met Adrian at a fundraising dinner for St. Helena Children's Medical Center. He was 41, 15 years older than me, and well known in Savannah business circles. Adrian was attentive in a way that felt rare. He remembered that I hated lilies. He sent my father a handwritten thank you note after their first meeting. When I mentioned my grandmother's sapphire earrings, he found a bracelet in the same antique style for my birthday. I called it romance. Years later, Daniel would call it intelligence gathering. Adrian and I married 11 months after we met. My father never openly opposed him, but during one private lunch, he said, "That man answers every question except the one you actually asked." I laughed and told him Adrian was simply careful with words.
4 months after the wedding, Adrian suggested I reduce my hours at Bennett & Rowe. "Only for a while," he said. "You've spent your life carrying your family's expectations. Let someone else carry something for you." He introduced me to a financial advisor named Martin Vale, who could simplify my accounts while I decided what I wanted married life to become. I agreed. I did not know Martin had been receiving payments from Adrian's company for almost a year. Stepping back felt like rest. Adrian made surrender sound like freedom. Then, 18 months into our marriage, my father died. He collapsed during a board presentation in October. A brain hemorrhage. No warning. He was 61. Grief made ordinary decisions feel impossible. Adrian took control of everything. He chose the funeral home, spoke to the board, answered attorneys, and placed documents in front of me at the kitchen island. "Sign here," he would say. "I've already reviewed it." And I signed. Some pages were estate forms, some were not. 3 months after the funeral, I heard Adrian speaking behind his study door. "The transfer is clean," he said. "She won't question it." When I stepped inside, he ended the call so quickly that his chair spun. He told me he was discussing a shipping contract for Cole Maritime. I wanted to believe him, so I did. There was another moment I ignored. 6 weeks after my father's death, his longtime attorney, Miriam Shaw, came to our house. I returned from counseling and found her arguing with Adrian beside the front steps. She held a folder against her chest. The instant they saw me, they stopped. Miriam looked at me as though she was waiting for me to ask the right question. I didn't. Adrian said she was upset because the company's leadership structure was changing. He told me grief made people possessive. I remember feeling embarrassed for her. She drove away without coming inside, and I never called her. For the next 3 years, our marriage looked peaceful from the outside. Adrian traveled constantly. I volunteered at the Children's Hospital and received quarterly reports from Bennett & Rowe that appeared ordinary. I did not know those reports had been edited before they reached me. 13 months before the courtroom hearing, I became pregnant. Adrian cried when I showed him the test. He knelt in front of me, pressed his forehead to my stomach, and promised our child would never want for anything. For a while, I believed the baby had repaired something between us. The first crack appeared when I was 5 months pregnant. I called Bennett & Rowe's investment administrator to change the beneficiary on an old family trust. I wanted the account to become my son's education fund. The woman on the phone hesitated. Then she told me I was no longer listed as an authorized decision maker. "That can't be right," I said. It's my trust. She checked again. There were 2 authorized names, Adrian Cole and Vanessa Reed. I had never heard her name before.
I ended the call and sat in my car for nearly an hour. The parking garage was almost empty. Rain tapped against the windshield, and my son shifted inside me as though he could feel my heartbeat accelerating. When I finally drove home, I said nothing to Adrian. Instead, I searched his office. I started with the desk drawers, then the filing cabinet, then the travel bags he rarely unpacked himself. Inside a black garment case from a recent trip to Charleston, I found a hotel invoice. Adrian Cole. Vanessa Reed. 1 suite, 4 nights. Behind it was a receipt from a jewelry store for $3,400. The purchase date was our anniversary. I had received flowers that year. I photographed everything and called my former college roommate, Maya Patel. Maya worked as a paralegal for a family law practice in Atlanta and was the only person I trusted to tell me the truth without trying to protect my feelings. I read the names on the account, then the hotel invoice. She remained silent for several seconds. "Do not confront him," she finally said. "Photograph every document, save copies somewhere he cannot access, and call a lawyer tomorrow." The next morning, I met Daniel Cross. He was in his late 40s, calm, direct, and unimpressed by Adrian's reputation. Daniel listened without interrupting while I explained the account, the hotel, my father's estate, and the papers I had signed after the funeral. When I finished, he closed his notebook. "Your husband's affair may be the least serious part of this," he said. His team began gathering records quietly. 3 weeks later, Daniel asked me to come to his office alone. A folder waited on the conference table. 11 days after my father's funeral, Bennett and Rowe Properties had been transferred into a newly formed holding company called Harborstone Management LLC. The name was bland enough to disappear inside a stack of legal filings. The sole managing member was Adrian Cole. "That's impossible," I said. "My father's will transferred control to me." Daniel turned the page. At the bottom of the ownership agreement was my signature, except it was not mine. It looked almost perfect, the shape, the slant, even the way I crossed the final letter of my surname. But the pressure was wrong, and my middle initial curved in a way I had never written it. Daniel had already sent it to a forensic document examiner. The preliminary report estimated a 95% probability that the signature had been copied or traced from another document. I stared at the page until the letters blurred. Then Daniel showed me the payment records. Martin Vale, the advisor Adrian had introduced shortly after our wedding, had been receiving monthly consulting fees from Cole Maritime for 10 months before I ever met him. Every recommendation Martin made to me had benefited Adrian. He consolidated my accounts, redirected statements, changed authorization permissions, moved assets into structures controlled through Harborstone. Martin had never worked for me. He had worked on me. The discovery forced another memory to the surface. During the first year of our marriage, I once returned home early from the hospital and found Adrian, Martin, and an unfamiliar man sitting in the study. Documents covered the desk. They stopped speaking the instant I entered. Adrian smiled and told me they were reviewing insurance policies. "Nothing you need to trouble yourself with," he said. At the time, I thought the sentence was patronizing. Now I understood it had probably been the first meeting where they discussed taking my father's company. Adrian sensed the change in me before I ever accused him. For the next 5 weeks, our marriage became a quiet war fought through ordinary conversations. His first move came over dinner. I asked whether Cole Maritime had any upcoming business in Charleston. Adrian studied me, then he sighed. "I've been worried about you," he said. "Ever since that confusion with the trust, you've seemed anxious. Is this the pregnancy or is something else happening?" The precision stunned me. He had taken my discovery that I had been removed from my own accounts and transformed it into evidence that I was unstable. I told him I was tired. He squeezed my hand as if he had forgiven me. 2 weeks later, I made a mistake. Maya helped me print the hotel invoice and several account statements. I left my laptop open on the kitchen counter while I answered the door. I was gone for less than 10 minutes. Adrian never mentioned what he saw. 3 days later, he brought home roses and said his sister was worried about me. "She thinks you should stop obsessing over money," he said. I called his sister the next morning. She had never spoken to him about me. That was when I began recording our conversations. At 7 months pregnant, I told Adrian the first wanted an independent advisor to review our accounts. His eyes filled with tears. He said his company was under pressure, his doctor was monitoring his heart, and more conflict might push him beyond what he could handle. Daniel's investigator later confirmed Adrian had not seen a cardiologist in over a year. His last examination showed no heart problems. He had invented an illness because my questions were becoming dangerous. 4 weeks before the hearing, Adrian explained that legal action would be expensive. "If you force this into court," he said, "I may not be able to provide the same support after the baby is born." Then he placed his hand on my stomach. "You need to think about what is best for him." I removed his hand. "That is exactly what I'm doing."
By then, Daniel's team had enough evidence to challenge the Harborstum transfer and request an emergency freeze. The moment Adrian was served, he changed tactics. He told colleagues I was suffering from prenatal anxiety. He told his family I had become paranoid and jealous of Vanessa, whom he called a harmless employee. He even contacted my Aunt Rebecca and suggested grief and pregnancy had damaged my judgment. Rebecca left me a frightened voicemail asking whether I was safe. That was when I understood the plan. While I had been building evidence privately, Adrian had been building a public version of me that no one would believe. But Daniel's team found something Adrian did not know they had. Buried in a batch of records was a wire transfer carrying a short internal note. Use the previous template. Daniel ordered his team to trace every document connected to it. 3 days later, he called me. "We've found another victim," he said. The same structure used to seize Bennett and Rowe had been used against someone else, and the name attached to those records was one I knew, Vanessa.
Daniel spread the newly discovered records across his conference table. Vanessa's father had died 2 years earlier, leaving her a trust intended to fund the design studio she wanted to open. Adrian convinced her that Harborstone could temporarily consolidate the money and reduce her tax burden. Instead, more than $170,000 had been transferred into accounts under Adrian's sole authority. The signatures matched the same forged pattern used on the Bennett and Rowe documents. Vanessa was not only his mistress, she was another person he had been stealing from. "Does she know?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "She thinks he is protecting her money." I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt sick. Adrian had not chosen between us. He had designed 2 different stories for 2 women and used each one to gain access to what belonged to them. Daniel filed our emergency motion that afternoon. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. By then, I was 34 weeks pregnant. The night before court, Adrian's attorney submitted a last-minute request to delay the hearing, claiming they needed time to respond to accusations made by an emotionally distressed spouse. Daniel called me just before 10. "They want you to postpone," he said. "That gives Adrian more time to convince people you're unstable." "I'm going," I told him. I barely slept. In the morning, I wore my only dark blue maternity dress. From a velvet box, I took out my grandmother's sapphire earrings, the ones Adrian had once pretended to admire because he knew they mattered to me. I reached the courthouse 17 minutes early. Daniel's chair beside me was empty. Another hearing had delayed him, but he promised he was coming. At 9:03, Adrian entered with 3 attorneys. Vanessa walked beside him in a cream suit, her hand linked through his arm. He whispered something and she laughed before they reached their table. Adrian looked completely relaxed. Before the bailiff called the room to order, he crossed the aisle and crouched beside me. "Sign the settlement," he whispered. "Walk away with enough money to start over. Keep fighting and you'll lose the company." "I want my father's company returned," I said. "I want access to my accounts and fair support for our son." Vanessa laughed behind him. "You married a successful man, got pregnant, and now you think you deserve everything he built?" People in the gallery turned toward us. I stood carefully. "Do not speak about my child." For a moment, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. Then Adrian murmured something to her, and it hardened into anger. "You have no idea what he has sacrificed because of you," Vanessa said. She believed she was defending the man who had stolen from her. "Actually, I know exactly what he has taken." Her hand moved before I finished. The slaps snapped my head sideways. My mouth struck my teeth, and warmth filled my lip. The courtroom erupted in gasps. My hands flew to my stomach. Across the aisle, Adrian looked at Vanessa's raised palm and smiled. "This," he said calmly, "is exactly the instability I warned everyone about." Judge Mercer was already standing. Her face had gone completely still. "Bailiff," she said. The room fell silent. "Lock it."
The lock clicked behind the bailiff, and the room seemed to stop breathing. Adrian's smile vanished. Judge Mercer looked at the blood on my lip, then at Vanessa. "Miss Reed, step away from the petitioner." Vanessa moved backward. One of Adrian's attorneys stood. "Your Honor, my client's wife has a documented history of—" "I did not ask you to characterize her," the judge said. "Sit down." He obeyed. Judge Mercer lifted a gray folder from beneath the bench. "Mr. Cole, are you aware of the supplemental filing delivered to Chambers at 7:12 this morning?" Adrian glanced at his attorneys. His lead counsel answered, "We have not reviewed it." "That is unfortunate," Judge Mercer replied, "because I have." For 11 minutes, the only sound was paper turning. The packet contained prenatal records, photographs of bruises I had blamed on clumsiness, and statements showing withdrawals from my father's life insurance account during the week of his funeral. It also contained the forensic report identifying my signature as almost certainly forged. Then the judge reached the final section. She removed her glasses and looked at Adrian. "Same method," she said. His face drained of color. "The transfer of Bennett and Rowe and the transfer of Miss Reed's trust use the same signature model, holding company, and financial intermediary." Vanessa stared at him. "What trust transfer?"
He said nothing. Judge Mercer continued. There is also an email from Mr. Cole to Martin Vale. Use the old template. Same firm. It disappeared once. It will disappear again. Vanessa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Adrian's attorney whispered into his ear. Adrian did not seem to hear him. His hands trembled against the table. It was the first time in 7 years I had seen him afraid. Daniel arrived 4 minutes later, breathless, carrying 2 boxes. My apologies, Your Honor. Sit down, counsel. Read the final section before you speak. Daniel scanned the pages and looked at me. Relief crossed his face. An anonymous email received before dawn had supplied the missing connection. A former Cole Maritime accountant had preserved messages Adrian believed were deleted. Those messages showed that he and Martin created Harborstone before my father died. They had not exploited my grief by accident. They had prepared for it. Daniel stood. We request an immediate freeze on every Harborstone account, restoration of Miss Bennett's authority over Bennett and Rowe, and referral of the apparent forgeries for criminal investigation. Judge Mercer turned to Vanessa. Did you authorize Mr. Cole to place your inheritance under his sole control? Vanessa shook her head. He said it was temporary. The money would be released when my studio opened. How much did you believe remained? $170,000. Judge Mercer checked the statement. The current balance is $28,000. Vanessa gripped a chair. You told me it was safe. Adrian finally looked at her. This is being misunderstood. Let my lawyers explain. She stepped away from him. No, you explain it. For once, Adrian had no calm sentence ready.
Judge Mercer allowed the silence to stretch until it became unbearable. Then she spoke. This court is ordering an immediate freeze on all accounts held by Harborstone Management LLC, including any subsidiaries or connected entities. No transfer, withdrawal, sale, or restructuring may occur without court approval. Adrian's lead attorney stood again. Your Honor, such an order would severely disrupt my client's business operations. That appears to be a consequence of your client placing disputed assets inside his business operations, she replied. Sit down. The attorney lowered himself into his chair. Judge Mercer continued. Temporary control of Bennett and Rowe properties will be restored to Clara Bennett, subject to independent oversight until a complete forensic audit is finished. The evidence concerning both signatures will be forwarded to the district attorney for criminal review. Vanessa looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. And my trust? She asked. You may pursue a separate civil claim, the judge said. Given the evidence before me, I strongly recommend that you obtain independent counsel. Adrian leaned toward Vanessa. Do not say another word without my lawyers present. She turned on him. Your lawyers? Her voice cracked. You told me Harborstone was ours. You said Clara had abandoned the company and that you were saving it from collapse. Adrian's expression hardened. This is not the place. There is no other place, Vanessa said. You took my father's money. The same woman who had struck me minutes earlier now looked terrified of the man she had entered the courtroom beside. I did not feel sympathy yet, but I recognized the fear. Judge Mercer turned toward me. Mrs. Cole. Bennett, I said quietly. The judge paused. Ms. Bennett, would you like to address the court before I adjourn? I had not prepared a statement. My lip was swelling. My knees trembled beneath the table, and my son had become unusually still inside me. I stood with one hand pressed against the edge of the desk. For 7 years, Adrian had spoken first. He explained my emotions, corrected my memories, and described my choices as if he were the only reliable witness to my life. This time, he had to listen. You did not only cheat on me, I said. You waited until my father died, watched me lose the ability to think clearly, and used that grief to steal what he spent his entire life building. Adrian stared at the judge instead of me. You told me every decision was for my protection. You told me the accounts were too complicated. You said I should rest and let you handle everything. My voice shook, once, then steadied. You did not protect me from complexity. You protected yourself from being questioned. Adrian finally looked at me. Clara, think carefully, he said. Every word you say will affect our son. The old instinct rose inside me, the urge to lower my voice, soften the accusation, and make the room comfortable for him. Then I remembered his smile after the slap. Do not use him to frighten me, I said. Everything that happens next is because of what you did, not because I told the truth about it. Vanessa sat down heavily behind his table, putting an empty chair between them. Adrian's calm expression slipped. You are destroying your own family. No, I said. I am finally saving what is left of it. Judge Mercer struck the gavel once. This hearing is adjourned. The asset restrictions are effective immediately. The bailiff will provide copies of the order, and Ms. Reed will remain until officers document the assault witnessed in this courtroom. The doors were unlocked. Adrian's attorneys surrounded him before he could move. As I gathered my papers, he leaned toward me one last time. You will regret making this public. I touched the blood drying at the corner of my mouth. For the first time in 7 years, I said,
I do not believe you. The first week after the hearing passed in fragments. The district attorney opened a formal investigation on Monday. By Wednesday, forensic accountants were inside Bennett and Rowe's records. By Friday, Cole Maritime's board placed Adrian on administrative leave. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt exhausted. Daniel warned me that exposing the scheme was only the beginning. Harborstone had been built through shell companies and internal loans designed to make stolen money look ordinary. The forensic team found Bennett and Rowe. They found Vanessa's trust. Then they found a third account. It was a custodial fund my father had opened when I was 10. He had deposited birthday money, investment returns, and part of every summer paycheck I earned. It was meant to help me buy my first home. Adrian transferred it into Harborstone during our second year of marriage. $31,000. Compared with the company and Vanessa's inheritance, it was small, but that was the number that made me cry. The larger thefts felt abstract, corporate, and too enormous to hold in one thought. That account felt personal. Adrian had reached backward into a life that existed before him and taken from the child I used to be. Martin Vale was arrested 11 weeks later. He accepted a plea agreement requiring him to testify against Adrian. His statement was cold and detailed. He explained how Harborstone had been planned during the first year of my marriage. He redirected statements so I would not see authorization changes. Adrian selected documents containing my cleanest signatures. Then they waited for a crisis severe enough that I would sign whatever was placed before me. My father's death had not created Adrian's opportunity. It had activated a plan already waiting. Martin also explained the confrontation I had witnessed between Adrian and Miriam Shaw. Miriam found inconsistencies in the succession papers weeks after the funeral. She called me twice. Adrian intercepted both messages and told her I had requested no contact while I grieved. Then he told me she was unstable. When Daniel gave me the transcript, I read that section 3 times. Miriam had tried to warn me. I had simply never been allowed to hear her. Vanessa called 8 days after the courtroom incident. When I answered, she was crying. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said. "I know what I did, but I didn't know about your father's company. Adrian said you abandoned the business years ago. He told me you were using the pregnancy to force him back into a marriage that was already over," she continued. "He said Harborstone was protecting both of us. Even his lies made each woman believe the other was the danger. I believe you didn't know," I said, "but believing you is not the same as forgiving you. I understand." 3 weeks later, Vanessa filed her own lawsuit. We did not become friends. The slap stood between us. But during the months that followed, we sometimes sat on opposite sides of the same hallway waiting for hearings. Occasionally, our eyes met. There was no warmth in those moments, only recognition.
Not everyone reacted the way I expected. My Aunt Rebecca called the week after the hearing. We had barely spoken for almost 2 years, after an argument about my father's estate that I now viewed differently. She cried before she managed to finish her first sentence. "I tried to warn you after the funeral," she said. "Adrian told me you didn't want family interfering." I remembered accusing her of being bitter and disrespectful. At the time, I believed those words were mine. Now I wondered how many of them Adrian had quietly placed in my mouth.
Miriam Shaw agreed to help Daniel's team once the criminal investigation became public. She still had the original succession documents she had prepared with my father 8 months before his death. Those papers named me as controlling successor of Bennett and Rowe and prohibited any transfer of the company without my verified approval and an independent board vote. Neither condition had been met. Miriam's originals became some of the strongest evidence in the case. When we met for the first time since the argument in my driveway, I struggled to look at her. "I'm sorry I never called," I said. "You were grieving," she replied. "I still should have listened. You were never given the full conversation." She did not absolve me completely, but she did not punish me either. Somehow, that kindness hurt more than anger would have. Cole Maritime's board moved quickly once Adrian's actions threatened a company's reputation. An internal review uncovered suspicious vendor payments, altered invoices, and transactions approved through Martin's consulting firm. 2 former employees contacted Daniel separately. Both described Adrian pressuring staff to change dates on expense reports and route money through accounts that did not match the services listed. Neither employee wanted to testify in the criminal case, but their statements supported the civil claims and showed that Adrian's dishonesty had never been limited to our marriage. There was a strange comfort in that. I had not failed to discover one secret life. I had been living inside a pattern that existed long before me. A local reporter had been sitting in the gallery on the morning of the hearing. She had arrived to cover another case, but stayed after the judge sealed the doors. 2 days later, the story appeared online. The article avoided most names, but Savannah was small enough that people understood who it described within hours. Some strangers treated my life like entertainment. They debated whether I had known about the affair, whether Vanessa deserved sympathy, and whether the judge had acted too aggressively. But the private messages surprised me. Women I barely knew wrote about husbands who controlled every account, partners who called them unstable whenever they asked questions, and relatives who slowly convinced them not to trust their own memories. I did not answer most of those messages. I did not have the strength.
but I saved every one. They reminded me that Adrian's greatest success had not been stealing money. It had been convincing me I was alone. 2 months into the proceedings, Adrian's mother, Helen, sent me a handwritten card. I raised him to know better, it said. I do not have an explanation that makes this less terrible. I am sorry. I kept it, because it was the only message from his family that did not minimize what he had done. Adrian made 2 final attempts to regain control. First, a new attorney challenged the asset freeze as unconstitutional. Judge Mercer denied the motion in a brief written order, calling the argument unsupported and frivolous. The second attempt was quieter. 3 weeks before my due date, a mutual friend contacted me and suggested Adrian might stop fighting for custody if I reduced my financial claims. I did not reply. I forwarded the message to Daniel. He sent it directly to the district attorney as possible witness intimidation. Within days, Adrian's bail conditions were changed. He was forbidden from contacting me, directly, through friends, or through anyone except his attorneys.
A month after the hearing, I sat alone in the nursery and finally allowed myself to grieve. The walls were pale green, a color Adrian and I had chosen when I still believed we were preparing the room together. Tiny clothes hung in the closet, an unopened crib stood against the wall. For weeks, anger and court deadlines had kept me moving. That night, none of it was enough. I cried for the marriage I had wanted, not the one I actually had. I mourned the man from the hospital fundraiser, the one who remembered small details, listened carefully, and made me feel chosen. I understood something while sitting on the nursery floor. Missing the person I believed Adrian was did not make me weak. That person had never existed, but my love for him had been real. The investigation moved slowly after that. Forensic accountants traced approximately $2.4 million through Harborstone, Bennett and Rowe, Vanessa's trust, and several smaller accounts. The final report was more than 200 pages long. Adrian changed attorneys 4 times. Each new lawyer arrived promising a different explanation. The signatures were administrative errors. Martin had acted alone. I had authorized the transfers and forgotten. Vanessa had misunderstood their arrangement. Every explanation collapsed against the records. Martin's testimony proved Adrian had selected the signature samples himself. Emails showed him approving each transfer. Bank logs placed him inside the accounts within minutes of the transactions. Facing trial, Adrian accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of embezzlement, and 1 count involving fraudulent financial records. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 4 and ordered full restitution with interest. I attended the sentencing but did not speak. Adrian looked at me once as officers led him away. There was no apology in his expression, only disbelief that the rules had finally applied to him. Bennett and Rowe returned to my control 4 months after the courtroom hearing. With Miriam's help, the board restored the protections my father had created before Adrian dismantled them. I moved into my father's old office. For the first several weeks, I could not sit behind his desk without feeling like an imposter. Then, one morning, I found a note in the bottom drawer written in his handwriting. "Clara sees people clearly," it said. "She only needs to trust that she does." I sat there holding the page until the words stopped shaking. My son, Samuel Thomas Bennett, was born 5 weeks after the hearing and nearly 3 weeks before his due date. Maya stood beside me during labor. Aunt Rebecca held my other hand. Adrian was not present. The no-contact order had been issued 9 days earlier. When the nurse placed Samuel on my chest, he opened his eyes for only a second before falling asleep. It was the first uncomplicated happiness I had felt in more than a year. He was not evidence. He was not leverage. He was not the reason Adrian and I had stayed together or the reason we separated. He was simply my son. Untangling the rest of my life took much longer. There were accounts to close, property records to correct, and tax filings to repair. Daniel advised me to sell the house because part of its down payment had been connected to Harborstone funds. I moved with Samuel into a smaller home near the hospital. It had 2 bedrooms, an uneven porch, and windows that filled the kitchen with morning light. For the first time in 7 years, every key belonged only to me.
The first year after Samuel's birth was quieter than the one before it, but not easier. Restitution payments began arriving every 3 months. Each deposit was only a fraction of what Adrian had taken, and every payment required new tax documents, court confirmations, and conversations with accountants. Still, the money landed in accounts bearing only my name. That detail mattered more than the amount. Martin's full testimony answered questions I had carried for years. He confirmed that Adrian began planning the Harborstone structure 4 months after our wedding. The meeting I had interrupted in the study, the one Adrian dismissed as insurance paperwork, had been a strategy session. They had been comparing my signatures. They were also discussing how to gradually reduce my involvement in Bennett and Rowe without alarming the board. Martin admitted he recommended every financial change Adrian asked for because Adrian paid him twice what his normal clients did. "Did Mrs. Bennett understand that you represented her husband's interests?" Daniel asked during the deposition. "No.
Did you ever disclose that conflict?
No. And did Mr. Cole instruct you to keep it from her?
Martin lowered his eyes. Yes. The answer was expected, but hearing it aloud still felt like something breaking. The house sold 6 months after Samuel was born. I walked through each run one final time while movers carried out the last boxes. The kitchen island remained scratched, where Adrian had pushed documents toward me after my father's death. For years, I had thought of that kitchen as the place where he cared for me. Now it looked like the scene of a crime no camera had ever recorded. I left the keys on the counter and did not look back when I closed the door. The custody case resolved more simply than Daniel expected. Adrian's conviction and incarceration removed most of the arguments his attorneys had threatened to raise.
Judge Naomi Ellis granted me sole legal and physical custody. She allowed for the possibility of supervised visitation after Adrian's release, but only if he completed a psychological evaluation and demonstrated a stable period without further violations. That provision frightened me more than I admitted. It was easier to think of Adrian behind prison walls than to imagine the day he might stand in front of Samuel and introduce himself as his father. But that day was years away. I had spent too much of my life living inside disasters that had not happened yet. I started therapy when Samuel was 2 months old. At first, I went because I could not sleep. Every unexpected phone call made my heart race. Every document requiring a signature made my hands shake. My therapist, Dr. Leah Morgan, asked a question during our 4th session. Why do you think Adrian was able to make you doubt yourself for so long? I hated the question. It sounded like blame. For several weeks, I answered by listing his lies, his preparation, and the ways he isolated me. All of those answers were true, but they were not complete. Eventually, I understood what she was asking. I had spent my childhood trying to become strong enough for my father's company, strong enough for his expectations, and strong enough for the Bennett name. Adrian offered me permission to become smaller. At first, smaller felt peaceful. He made decisions so I could rest. He handled money so I would not worry. He spoke for me so I would not have to defend every choice. I mistook the absence of responsibility for safety. That did not make his actions my fault. But understanding why his version of love had once felt comforting helped me recognize what I would never accept again. Vanessa and I continued exchanging occasional messages. Most concerned court dates or documents connected to Harborstone. Sometimes she sent updates about her civil case. A year after the slap, she wrote, "I think about that morning every day. I am sorry." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I think about it too. That was all. Forgiveness, I learned, was not a door that opened once. Some days, it opened slightly. Other days, it remained locked.
Samuel is 2 years old now. He has my father's serious eyes and, to my occasional frustration, Adrian's easy smile. For the first several months, every resemblance frightened me. When Samuel tilted his head a certain way or laughed with the same sudden brightness Adrian once had, I felt my body tense before my mind could stop it. I worried that some part of Adrian had been passed down like a hidden defect waiting to appear. Dr. Morgan helped me understand how unfair that fear was. A smile was not manipulation. Confidence was not cruelty. Samuel was not a collection of inherited warnings. He was his own person, still discovering the world one cabinet door and broken crayon at a time. I stopped searching his face for evidence. Bennett & Rowe completed its 2nd full year under my leadership that spring. The company was smaller than it had been before Adrian entered our lives. Several properties had been sold to cover debts created through Harborstone, and some relationships with lenders had to be rebuilt from the beginning. But the company was stable. More importantly, it was honest again. I created new rules requiring independent approval for every major transfer. No executive, including me, could move significant funds without 2 board signatures and outside review. Some people called the system overly cautious. I called it memory made useful. I kept my father's desk. The wood was scratched, and one corner had faded from years of sunlight. A designer suggested replacing it with something modern, but I had it restored instead. Some things deserved repair rather than removal. On Thursday afternoons, I continued volunteering at St. Helena Children's Medical Center. It was the same hospital where I first met Adrian. For a while, walking into the building made me feel as if my old life were waiting near the entrance. I could still picture him standing beside the fundraising display, adjusting his cufflinks, and asking about the seating plan before he asked my name. I once considered leaving the hospital entirely. Then I realized I did not want him to own the beginning of that story forever. The hospital had existed before Adrian. My work there had meaning without him, and abandoning it would have turned another part of my life into property he had taken. So I stayed. One Thursday, after finishing my shift, I drove Samuel home and passed the courthouse. The route went directly by the wide stone steps I had climbed alone at 34 weeks pregnant. I slowed down without meaning to. For months, the sight of the building had brought back the sound of Vanessa's hands striking my face. I remembered the taste of blood, Adrian's smile, and the sudden stillness of the room when Judge Mercer ordered the doors locked. That day, the memory felt different. I did not see myself as helpless at the defense table. I saw a woman who had arrived early, carrying evidence and a child, without knowing whether anyone would believe her. A woman whose lawyer had not yet arrived. A woman surrounded by people who expected her to surrender. And yet she stayed seated.
The slap had been the most humiliating moment of my life, but it also made Adrian's contempt visible to everyone in the room. For years, his cruelty had existed through calm explanations and altered memories. It left no broken furniture, no shouting neighbors, and no photographs convincing enough to show a court. Vanessa's hand left a mark people could finally see. I used to hate that this was what it took. Now I understood the mark had not saved me. The documents did. Daniel did. Miriam did. Maya did. But most of all, the version of me who finally stopped explaining Adrian's behavior for him did.
The legal file officially closed 14 months after the hearing. By then, the final restitution order had been approved, Bennett and Rowe's ownership records corrected, and Harborstone management dissolved. At our last meeting, Daniel placed a cardboard box on the conference table. Inside were bank statements, emails, forensic reports, depositions, and photographs from the courtroom. Most people never get this much proof, he said. Not because their stories are less true, because people like Adrian usually leave confusion, not records. I understood. For months, I had called the outcome justice, but justice was only part of it. There had also been luck. A garment bag Adrian forgot to empty, a hotel invoice he assumed I would never find, Miriam keeping the original succession papers, an accountant deciding old messages mattered enough to send before dawn, and Judge Mercer choosing to read every page instead of treating our case as another bitter divorce. I had fought for the truth. But I had also been fortunate enough to possess evidence strong enough to make other people see it. Many women never receive that confirmation. They know something is wrong, but every incident can be explained away alone. A missing statement, a conversation remembered differently, a concern turned into proof of jealousy. Adrian had done that to me for years. He never shouted. He never broke a plate or punched a wall. He simply described my life back to me with small alterations until his version sounded more reasonable than my own memory. That kind of harm is difficult to show. It does not photograph well. It rarely enters a room loudly enough for witnesses to turn their heads. Except on that morning in court. Sometimes I wondered whether Vanessa's slap had been the first honest thing in our entire triangle. It was cruel and unforgivable, but it exposed what Adrian had spent years disguising. He believed my pain was funny, my fear was useful, and my silence was guaranteed. He miscalculated. I named my son Samuel Thomas after my father, but I gave him my surname. Some people assumed it was meant to punish Adrian. It was not. I wanted Samuel to carry the name of the man who taught me that stewardship mattered more than ownership. A man whose company had been stolen from me on paper, but whose values remained. On the anniversary of the hearing, Bennett and Rowe held its spring shareholder dinner. I wore my grandmother's sapphire earrings again. Before entering the ballroom, I caught my reflection in the dark glass. The scar on my lip had faded. Unless I pointed to the exact place, no one would know it had ever been split. For a moment, I thought about inheritance. Money could be redirected, companies hidden, names removed from accounts, signatures copied, but there were parts of my family Adrian had never reached. My father's discipline, my grandmother's stubbornness, the certainty that something belonging to you remains yours even after someone spends years insisting otherwise. I walked into the ballroom and took my seat at the head of the table. Not because I had inherited the position, because I had finally earned my way back to it.
Rebuilding Bennett and Rowe required more than returning my name to the ownership documents. Adrian had spent years changing the company's culture. Senior managers had learned not to question unusual instructions. Accountants had been told that complicated transactions were confidential. Board members received summaries instead of full records, and employees who raised concerns were quietly transferred away from important projects. I could not simply remove Adrian and pretend everything underneath him was healthy. During my first year as chief executive, I met privately with every department head. Some conversations were uncomfortable. A few employees admitted they had noticed irregularities but remained silent because Adrian controlled promotions and bonuses. Others insisted they had known nothing and became defensive when asked ordinary questions. 2 managers resigned before the internal review was finished. Another was dismissed after investigators discovered he had approved false invoices, even though he understood exactly what they were. I learned that restoring integrity sometimes meant losing people who claimed loyalty to the company while protecting only themselves. Miriam helped me create an independent ethics committee. Employees could report concerns without going through their supervisors, and every complaint had to be reviewed outside the department involved. I also changed how executive decisions were documented. No more private verbal approvals, no more instructions that disappeared after a phone call. Every important decision required a written explanation and a record of who had reviewed it. At the first board meeting where I presented the new rules, one longtime director smiled and said, "Your father trusted people more than this?" "My father trusted people who understood that trust came with responsibility," I answered. Adrian used trust as permission to avoid oversight. No one argued after that.
the company slowly recovered. We restored relationships with lenders, reopened 2 development projects Adrian had neglected, and sold a luxury property he had purchased mainly to impress business associates. The sale paid several outstanding debts and funded a new housing renovation project near the river. For the first time, I began making decisions that were not reactions to Adrian. That distinction felt important. Survival had guided every choice for nearly 2 years. Eventually, I needed to remember how to build something again.
Vanessa's lawsuit ended in a settlement 18 months after the courtroom hearing. She recovered part of her inheritance through the asset freeze and received an additional judgment against Adrian. She used the money to open a small design studio outside Charleston. She sent me a photograph on opening day. The space had white brick walls, tall windows, and a modest brass sign bearing her own name. Under the picture, she wrote, "This should have happened years ago." I replied, "I'm glad it finally did." That was the closest we came to friendship. I never forgot what she had done in court. Forgiveness did not require pretending the slap had not happened, but I also stopped thinking of her only as the woman who struck me. She had been cruel, responsible, and deceived at the same time. Human beings, I learned, could occupy more than one category. Adrian had always depended on simple categories. He was the provider. I was emotional. Vanessa was loyal. I was jealous. He was rational. Everyone who questioned him was unstable. Once those categories collapsed, so did much of his power. The truth was messier. I had ignored warnings, Vanessa had harmed me, employees had remained silent, Martin had chosen money over duty, and Adrian had deliberately arranged all of it. Understanding the complexity did not reduce his responsibility, it made his planning clearer. One afternoon, Daniel called to tell me Adrian had completed the first stage of a prison financial responsibility program. The restitution payments might increase slightly. He is also beginning to ask about future parole eligibility, Daniel said. My body reacted before my mind did. My chest tightened, my hands became cold. Parole was still years away, but the word made the future feel suddenly close. That evening, after Samuel fell asleep, I opened the file I had created for him. For a moment, I wanted to plan every possible hearing, every question, and every danger. Then I closed the folder. Adrian had already taken enough of my past. I was not going to give him years of my future before he even arrived there.
The hardest part of recovery was learning that peace did not arrive all at once. Some mornings I woke feeling completely free. Other mornings, a harmless sound, the click of a locked door, a man laughing quietly in a restaurant, the smell of Adrian's old cologne on a stranger, pulled me backward before I understood what was happening. Dr. Morgan called them echoes. The danger is gone, she told me. Your body simply has not received every update yet. I began carrying a small notebook. Whenever an old memory surfaced, I wrote down what had happened and what was true now. Adrian controlled the accounts, now I controlled them. Adrian intercepted calls, now no one filtered who could reach me. Adrian told me I was incapable of running the company, now more than 80 people came to work each morning under decisions I had made. The exercise felt childish at first. Eventually, it became proof. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Judge Mercer's clerk. The judge was retiring, and former attorneys and litigants had been invited to submit brief notes for a private commemorative book. For 3 days, I did not know what to write. Judge Mercer had not rescued me. Daniel's evidence had already existed. The forensic analysis, the emails, and Miriam's original documents were what changed the case. But the judge had done something equally important. She had stopped the room. She had refused to let Adrian's attorneys turn violence into a story about my instability. She had taken time to read when rushing would have been easier. Finally, I wrote, "Thank you for treating the truth as something worth pausing for." I signed it Clara Bennett, not Clara Cole. The name still gave me a small jolt of recognition whenever I wrote it. A few weeks later, I attended a legal fundraiser with Daniel and Miriam. It was held in the same courthouse where the hearing had taken place. I almost declined the invitation. Instead, I asked Maya to come with me. The building looked smaller at night. Without attorneys rushing through the corridors and families waiting anxiously on wooden benches, it seemed almost ordinary. We passed the courtroom doors. I stopped. "Do you want to go inside?" Maya asked. The room was unlocked and empty. I walked to the table where I had sat 34 weeks pregnant with my hands folded across my stomach. The judge's bench was dark. The gallery seats were silent. For years, I had remembered the room only through the slap. Standing there again, I noticed other things. The window behind the bench, the scratches along the table, the exact distance between my chair and the locked doors. I placed my hand on the back of the seat. "This is where I thought everything was ending," I said. Maya stood beside me. Something was. She was right. My marriage ended there. So did Adrian's control of Bennett and Rowe, his access to my money, and his ability to define me before I had the chance to speak. But something else began in that room too. Not courage, I had possessed courage long before I recognized it. What began was evidence of my own courage. There is a difference. For years, I believed strength had to feel powerful while it was happening. I imagined brave people knew exactly what to say and never doubted themselves afterward. I know better now. Sometimes strength looks like a woman sitting alone at a courtroom table while her lawyer is late. Sometimes it looks like blood on her lip and one hand over her unborn child. Sometimes it is nothing more dramatic than remaining in the room long enough for the truth to arrive.
2 years after Adrian's sentencing, Daniel called with news I had expected eventually, but still was not ready to hear. Adrian's attorneys had filed a request for an early review of his parole eligibility. The request did not mean he would be released. It meant only that the board would examine his conduct, restitution progress, and participation in prison programs. Still, when Daniel said the word hearing, I felt the old courtroom return around me. The locked doors, the blot on my lip, Adrian's quiet laugh. For several minutes I said nothing. "You are not required to attend," Daniel told me. "You can submit a written statement." That evening, after Samuel was asleep, I opened the folder containing Adrian's letters. I had not read most of them. The newest one had arrived 3 months earlier. Daniel's office had marked several passages because they contained indirect requests regarding Samuel. Adrian wrote that he had changed. He described completing financial courses, counseling sessions, and work assignments. He claimed prison had taught him humility. Then, halfway through the letter, he wrote, "I hope one day you can admit that none of this would have become so destructive if you had spoken to me privately instead of turning our family into a public case." I stopped reading. There it was again. His actions were mistakes. My response was destruction. Even after conviction, restitution, and years behind bars, he still believed the real offense was that I had allowed other people to see what he had done. I began writing my statement that night. The first version was angry. It listed every forged signature, every intercepted message, every stolen account, and every lie he had told about my mental health. The second version was colder and sounded like something written by a lawyer. Neither felt right. Finally, I wrote about Samuel. I explained that our son was growing up safe, stable, and surrounded by people who did not use love as leverage. I wrote that Adrian had never once taken full responsibility without adding an excuse or assigning part of the blame to someone else. I did not ask the board to punish him forever. I asked them to look closely at whether completing programs was the same as understanding harm. At the hearing, Adrian appeared by video. He looked older. His hair had turned gray at the sides, and the confidence that once filled every room seemed reduced. For one dangerous second, I felt sorry for him. Then the board asked why he believed he was ready for release. Adrian spoke about his good behavior, his work record, and the difficulty of being separated from his son. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes. He never mentioned my father. He never mentioned Vanessa. He never mentioned the money. One board member finally asked, "Who was harmed by your actions?" Adrian paused. "My family," he said. "Be specific." Another pause. "My former wife and others." Others. That single word told me everything. Vanessa had a name. Martin's betrayed clients had names. The employees pressured into falsifying records had names. But in Adrian's version, they remained background characters in a story about his suffering. The board denied early release. They scheduled another review for 18 months later. Outside the building, Daniel asked how I felt. I expected relief. Instead, I felt tired. I kept waiting for him to say one honest sentence, I told him. Daniel looked back toward the entrance. Some people think consequences are the same thing as accountability. On the drive home, I stopped at Samuel's preschool. He ran toward me holding a painting covered in blue handprints. "This is our house," he announced. The picture looked nothing like a house. It did not matter. I lifted him into my arms, and he pressed the paper against my shoulder. For years, Adrian had made home feel like a place where every word could be used against me. Samuel had drawn ours with open windows, a crooked roof, and 2 figures standing side by side. No locked doors, no hidden accounts, no one erased.
The next 18 months passed without another letter from Adrian. At first, the silence made me uneasy. For years, I had learned to expect his next move. A new attorney, a carefully worded message, a mutual friend calling with concern that was not really theirs. When nothing came, part of me remained alert anyway. Dr. Morgan told me that freedom could feel unfamiliar after control. "You spent years predicting him," she said. "Your mind still believes vigilance is keeping you safe." Slowly, I learned to let ordinary days remain ordinary. Samuel started kindergarten. Bennett and Rowe opened its first new development since the criminal investigation, a modest, mixed-use building near the waterfront, with affordable apartments above locally owned shops. My father had discussed a similar project years earlier. At the opening ceremony, I stood beneath a temporary canopy while rain threatened overhead. Employees, investors, and city officials gathered around the entrance. Samuel held my hand and swung it impatiently while the mayor spoke. When it was my turn, I looked at the building behind me. "This project is not important because it proves our company survived," I said. "Survival is only the beginning. It matters because it proves we can build honestly after being taught how easily trust can be abused." Afterward, Miriam approached me. "Your father would have liked that." For once, I did not dismiss the compliment or explain why I did not deserve it. "I think so too," I said. Vanessa attended the opening. I had not expected her. She stood near the back in a dark coat, looking uncertain about whether she belonged there.
When the crowd began to leave, she approached me. Her design studio had completed the interiors for 2 of the storefronts through a competitive contract process managed by someone who did not know our history. "I almost withdrew when I found out it was your project," she admitted. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't want him deciding what work either of us was allowed to do." I understood. Samuel ran toward us holding a paper flag. Vanessa looked down at him. "He has your eyes," she said. "Mostly when he's suspicious." She laughed, then stopped, as if uncertain whether laughter between us was permitted. It was not friendship, but it was no longer hostility either. Before leaving, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a cashier's check, covering the medical expenses from the courtroom assault, and a handwritten note. "I should have paid this years ago. I know money does not undo it." I considered returning the check. Instead, I deposited it into the Children's Hospital Fund in Samuel's name. The second parole hearing took place that winter. I did not attend. Daniel submitted an updated statement and called me afterward. Adrian's release had been denied again, but the board noted modest progress. He had finally referred to Vanessa by name and acknowledged that the forged documents were not mistakes, but deliberate acts. "Do you believe him?" I asked. Daniel was quiet. "I believe he has learned what accountability is supposed to sound like." That answer stayed with me. Change could not be measured by words alone, especially when words had always been Adrian's favorite tool. But I also realized I no longer needed to decide whether he had truly changed. That responsibility belonged to evaluators, judges, and eventually, perhaps, Samuel. My task was not to interpret Adrian forever. My task was to live. That spring, I packed away the final box from the criminal case. I kept the court orders, the forensic report, and the documents Samuel might someday need. But I threw away duplicates, old notes, and photographs of accounts that no longer existed. At the bottom of the box was the Navy maternity dress I had worn to court. A faint brown mark remained near the collar where my blood had dried before anyone brought me a towel. I held the dress for several minutes. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back inside. Not every painful thing had to be destroyed. Some objects were reminders of what happened. Others were proof of who walked away. 5 years have passed since the morning in Judge Mercer's courtroom. Samuel is old enough now to ask questions without simple answers. One evening, he noticed the faint line at the corner of my mouth. "Did someone hurt you?" he asked. "A long time ago." "Were you scared?" "Yes." He thought about that. "But you're okay now." "I am." Children do not always need the whole story. Sometimes they only need to know that fear can end. Adrian was released under supervision shortly before Samuel's 5th birthday. The court did not grant visitation immediately. He had to complete evaluations, maintain employment, continue restitution, and submit every request through legal channels. Months later, Daniel's office forwarded a letter from him. There were no accusations and no demands for forgiveness. Adrian wrote that Samuel might never want a relationship with him and that this would be a consequence, not an injustice. Perhaps he meant it. Perhaps he had only learned what accountability was supposed to sound like. I no longer needed to decide. His sincerity was not the foundation of my safety anymore. The first supervised visit was eventually scheduled for 1 hour in a family services building. A counselor stayed with Samuel while I waited nearby. When he came out, he looked thoughtful rather than frightened. "He looks like me," Samuel said. "Yes." He gave me a book. That was kind. Samuel took my hand. "Can we go home now?" And we did. That was the difference between the life I had built and the one Adrian controlled. No one had to remain in a room because another person demanded it. Bennett & Rowe is preparing to celebrate its 50th anniversary. It is not the largest company in the region, and I no longer care whether it ever becomes the largest. It is profitable. It pays people fairly. Its records can survive daylight. My father would have considered that success. The Navy maternity dress still rests in a sealed box at the back of my closet. I keep it beside my grandmother's sapphire earrings and the court order restoring the company to me. The dress remembers fear. The earrings remember where I came from. The order remembers that someone believed me. But the most important proof is not inside that box. It is Samuel running across the porch each afternoon. It is my signature on company documents, written only after every page has been read. It is the quiet of my home, which no longer feels like a warning. People sometimes ask whether I am grateful for what happened in that courtroom because it exposed Adrian. I am not. I'm not grateful for the slap, the theft, the betrayal, or the years spent doubting my own mind. Pain does not become a gift simply because we survive it. But I am grateful for the woman I became when survival was no longer enough. Adrian believed I would always choose silence over conflict. He believed he could remove my name from accounts, isolate me from the people who loved me, and calmly explain every instinct away. His greatest mistake was not the forged signature. It was believing that because I had trusted him, I would never trust myself again. He was wrong. The mark on my face disappeared, my name came back, and when I pass the courthouse now, I do not remember the slap first. I remember the lock turning. I remember Adrian's smile vanishing. And I remember standing in that sealed room with one hand over my unborn son, realizing that the truth had finally become impossible to silence.